In this video we look at the probabilities, finding probabilities of single values using a normal distribution. So here's an example of some potatoes. These potatoes are normally distributed. They have a mean of 150 grams, so the mean mass of a potato is 150 grams, and the standard deviation here is 20, so the distance from here to here is 20, so that's the standard deviation. Now we've talked before about how to find the probability, for example, that the mass of a potato is between 110 and 130 grams. In order to do that, we want to find the area under the curve here. And we can use z-scores to change this to the standard normal distribution and look up the probabilities using a table. So that's kind of a recap of how we use a normal distribution to calculate probabilities. I want to talk a little bit though about what happens if instead of finding the probability in a certain range, we want to find an exact probability of a single value. So for example, what is the probability that a potato chosen at random has a mass of exactly 130 grams? Now I didn't do a very good job here of drawing a line, but I want you to see it. So 130 grams is right here. So we need to find the area under the curve at this section. The trouble with doing that is that the width of this section of the curve is 0. So the area of this section doesn't exist. It has a width. It has no width. It's exactly 0 units wide, 0 grams wide in this case, and it would go up to here. So we can't actually find the probability that x equals 130 or the mass equals 130 grams. So the way around that is that we do an approximation. We create an interval that we're happy with. And one example here might be to say, instead of looking at a mass of 130, let's look at the probability that the mass of the potato is between, I'll just write this down here so you can see it, 129.5 grams and 130.5 grams. Obviously the 130 gram potato is in this interval, but so are some others, and we need to decide, is going half a gram to either side an acceptable sort of margin of error? Not really error, but is it an acceptable margin to be off by? If not, we can choose a smaller interval. So if not, you might want to choose an interval of 129.9 grams and 130.1 grams, and choosing an appropriate interval. I think for the purposes here, the interval that we could look at, I think an appropriate interval would be 129.5 and 130.5 grams. So what we can do then is the probability of our random variable x, the mass of the potatoes, equaling 130 grams is approximately the probability that x is between 129.5 grams and 130.5 grams. And then we can use all of the other techniques that we would have used before. So the idea here would be to convert these values, these masses, into z-scores. So using the z-score formula, just a reminder, that looks like this. Z is equal to the x value minus the mean divided by the standard deviation. So we would do that with the 129.5, do that with the 130.5, and then have approximately the probability that z is between those two values that we've found. So we won't get into all the details here because you should know how to do this already, but if not, you can sort of check out one of the earlier videos and see how to do that. So then we can find, so again, then we're looking at this interval right here. This interval right here. And in order to find the area of this interval, well, that's just approximately equal to the probability that x is less, sorry, not x, z is less than 130.5. Sorry, we would need to know the z value here. So we would need to, let me just draw this curve here, approximately equivalent. So we would find the equivalent z value. I probably should have done this ahead of time so you can see it. And then we would find this z value here. Let's call this z1 and call this z2. And then here we want to know the probability that Z is less than whatever Z1 is. Sorry, Z2. Because again, we want this probability here minus this probability in here. And maybe we should do that in different colors so that we can see the difference. So let me just highlight those intervals. So that's here to here. And we can find the Z value, or the probability corresponding. Whoops, sorry, that didn't change colors as I expected it to. So find the probability in here, and from that subtract the probability here, and that'll leave us with the portion in the middle that we're after. This portion in here. So going back to finishing up the equation here, this would be the probability that Z is less than Z2 minus the probability that Z is less than Z1. Again, those Z scores that we calculate, here's Z1 and here's Z2. And that would give us an approximate probability. Again, you might argue that it's not precise enough. Maybe you want to distinguish the 129.5 gram potatoes from the 130 gram potatoes, in which case you can do that and you can just be more precise in your measurement. So that's a very quick rundown of how to deal with exact probabilities or probabilities for single values rather than looking on ranges.